What if that nagging feeling in the back of your neck was real? What if those hands reaching out from the dark that you believed were there were there? What if the monster in the basement really existed? And what if there was really something under the bed? Would you have the courage to face your fears?
Hello, brave souls. Today's story is called The Silent Plague. This is part 1, Inheritance. Thomas Maxwell had never been particularly close to his grandfather. The old man had always seemed distant, stern, hiding behind thick-rimmed glasses and an ever-present scowl. Their conversations were perfunctory at best, stilted exchanges about the weather or Thomas's academic progress. Nothing more. So when the call came that Grandpa Edwin had passed away at the age of 94, Thomas felt a strange hollowness rather than grief. "He left the house to you," his mother said over the phone, her voice carrying a hint of something Thomas couldn't quite place. Surprise? Resentment? "The lawyer says there are conditions." The conditions, as it turns out, were simple. Thomas had to live in the old Victorian home for at least 1 year before he could sell it or make any major changes. It seemed eccentric, but not entirely unexpected from a man who had lived his entire adult life within those walls. "Did he say why?" Thomas asked. A pause. "No, just that you had to be you." The house stood on the outskirts of Millfield, a small town that had once been a bustling industrial center, but now existed in that peculiar American limbo between forgotten and historic. 3 stories of weathered brick and ornate woodwork, surrounded by an overgrown garden and a wrought iron fence that had long ago surrendered to rust. Thomas parked his car in the gravel driveway and sat there for a moment, studying the place that was now, and probably, his. The late afternoon sun caught in the windows, making them gleam like watchful eyes. "Home sweet home," he muttered to himself, grabbing his duffel bag from the passenger seat. The key to the old Victorian in his hand, the brass tarnished by decades of use. It turned with surprising ease, as if the lock had been recently oiled. The door swung open with a low, mournful creak. The interior smelled of old books, furniture polish, and something else. Something metallic and sharp that tickled the back of Thomas's throat. The foyer was dominated by a massive grandfather clock that still ticked away with mechanical precision, marking time as it had for generations. Thomas spent the first day exploring, opening windows to let in fresh air, running his fingers over dusty surfaces, and trying to reconcile the austere man he had remembered with the evidence of a life that surrounded him. Bookshelves lined nearly every wall, filled with volumes on history, military strategy, medicine, and oddly, extensive collections on epidemiology and pathology. It was on the 3rd day, while cleaning out Edwin's study, that Thomas found the journal. It had been hidden behind a row of leather-bound medical texts, a slim volume bound in what appeared to be dark green canvas. No title marked its spine or cover. Thomas sat in his grandfather's chair, a worn leather armchair that held the impression of the old man's body, and opened the journal to its first page. July 17th, 1954. They're calling it Operation Silence now. Fitting, I suppose. The brass wants the whole thing buried, classified beyond top secret. As if you can classify away 2 million dead. As if you can stamp confidential on the memory of watching your best friend's eyes cloud over before he tries to tear out your throat. Dr. Wise says the vaccination program is nearly complete. 97% coverage. It should be enough to contain any residual infection. The official history is that it's a new polio vaccine. Clean. Simple. People line up willingly for protection from a disease they know, while remaining blissfully ignorant of the one we've been fighting. I dream of them still. Their faces, contorted and yet somehow vacant. The sounds they made. Not quite human anymore. The way they moved. Jerky and determined. Like broken wind-up toys with only one directive. Howard says I should burn this journal, that keeping records outside the official channels is dangerous. He's probably right. But someone needs to remember. Someone needs to know what really happened, even if it's just my grandson reading this long after I'm gone. Thomas looked up from the page, his heart pounding. This had to be fiction, right? Some sort of creative writing exercise at the beginning of a novel his grandfather had never finished. But the handwriting, tight, precise, cursive, was unmistakably Edwin's. The same script that had signed birthday cards with formal detachment for years. He flipped through more pages, reading fragments at random. The first cases appeared in rural Alabama, a logging community. By the time the CDC got involved, the entire town was gone. Another entry. Had to burn Pittsburgh. God help me. We had no choice. Another entry. The Russians are dealing with their own outbreak in Siberia. Cold slows them down but doesn't stop them. Nothing stops them except. Another entry. Developed a new weapon today. Ultraviolet radiation combined with a specific frequency of sound. It disrupts our neural pathways somehow. Why is this like throwing sand in the gears of a machine? Thomas closed the journal, his hands shaking slightly. This was elaborate, even for fiction. The details were too specific, the emotions too raw. He stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the overgrown garden as the sun began to set. His grandfather had been a military man. He knew that much. Some kind of special operations during the 1950s. But this was madness. And yet, Thomas remembered a conversation from his childhood, overheard at a rare family gathering. His grandfather and an old army buddy, both deep in their cups, speaking in hushed tones. You ever see them in your sleep, Eddie? Every goddamn night, Frank. They'd never believe us if we told them. Not in a million years. That's the point. That's the whole goddamn point. Thomas turned back to the study, seeing it with new eyes. The books on epidemiology. The strange detailed maps of the United States with strange markings in red ink. The multiple locks in every door. His gaze fell on an old painting of a pastoral landscape that hung slightly askew on the far wall. He crossed the room and lifted it, revealing a small wall safe. You gotta be kidding me, he whispered. The combination. What would Edwin have used? Thomas tried the old man's birthday. Nothing. His grandmother's birthday. Nothing. On a hunch, Thomas input the date from the first journal entry. 7/17/54. The safe clicked open. Inside was a single brass key with a tag that read, Basement, East Wing. Thomas hadn't even realized the house had an East Wing basement. The main basement was accessible through the kitchen, a damp space used mainly for storage and housing the ancient boiler. But as he explored the ground floor more carefully, Thomas discovered a narrow door tucked behind the pantry, previously hidden by shelving. The brass key slid into the lock with a satisfying click. The door opened to reveal a steep staircase disappearing into darkness. Thomas flicked the light switch, and bare bulbs flickered to life along the descent, casting long shadows on the stone walls. At the bottom, another door. This one made of steel with a serious-looking lock. The same key working here, though it turned with more resistance. The room beyond was like nothing Thomas could have imagined. It was large, at least 40 feet square, with a high ceiling supported by concrete pillars, and it was filled with evidence. Along one wall stood 6 mannequins dressed in what appeared to be military uniforms, but unlike any Thomas had ever seen. They were primarily a dull green color, but reinforced with what looked like leather and metal plates at the neck, forearms, and shins. Heavy gloves with steel-plated knuckles, helmets with thick face shields, and emblazoned on each shoulder was a patch. A skull surrounded by a biohazard symbol with the letters ZRF. Weapon racks lined another wall, holding an assortment of modified firearms. strange contraptions that emitted ultraviolet light, and an array of bladed weapons with odd angles and serrations. Each was meticulously labeled and maintained, as if ready for use at a moment's notice. Glass cases displayed maps showing the spread of the infection across North America, Europe, and parts of Asia. Newspaper clippings with headlines about mysterious illnesses and quarantine zones were pinned beside them, dating from 1952 to 1956. Official-looking documents stamped classified, detailed containment procedures and casualty reports. And in the center of the room, a large table held what appeared to be research materials, microscope slides, medical journals open to articles about neural parasites, and a thick binder labeled Pathogen Z, Properties and Weaknesses. Thomas stood frozen at the entrance, unable to process what he was seeing. This wasn't just elaborate. This was obsessive. Either his grandfather had been deeply delusional, constructing an entire alternate history of the 1950s, or something truly horrific had happened, something that had been systematically erased from public knowledge. With trembling fingers, Thomas opened the journal again, turning to the final entry. October 3rd, 1978. They've ordered the final purge of all records today. Operation Silence is complete. The last quarantine zones had been cleared, and the last witnesses have either taken the oath or have been retired. History has been rewritten. But I know better. We all do. Those of us who are there. And I've kept everything. The evidence, the weapons, the truth. Because they'll be back. Maybe not in my lifetime, but someday. And when that day comes, someone will have to remember. Someone will need to know how to fight. If you're reading this, I'm sorry for the burden I placed on you, but there was no one else I could trust. Learn, prepare, and whatever you do, don't open the red journal until you're ready to accept what's in it. Some truths are too heavy to bear all at once. They're still out there, waiting, and the silence won't last forever. Thomas closed the journal and looked around the room again, his mind reeling. In the far corner, he spotted a small red book on a pedestal, encased in glass like a museum exhibit. His grandfather, the stern, distant man who had hardly spoken 10 words to him at a time, had been preparing for this moment his entire life. The red journal waited for him, and with it, the truth about the war that history had forgotten. Well, I hope you enjoyed that part, guys. I'm not sure how far I'm going to go with this story, how many parts we're going to do, but expect at least 4 parts. So I hope you enjoyed this part of the story. Come back next time for some more of it. And as always, remember to face your fears.